Hello and welcome to an all-new series of videos, this time on the metaphysics of mind. This is such an exciting and relevant area of philosophy, a fusion of ideas of the philosophers that we've looked at before, as well as a lot of new faces. So we'll get the chance to explore the ideas of very recent thinkers, even some that are still alive. Yes, I did say this was going to be exciting. So what sorts of questions do we cover? What is the philosophy of mind? Well, I suppose the main area of discussion is what the mind is. Is the mind just a function of the brain? Is it something separate and distinct from the brain and the body? Is it a soul? What are these thoughts and feelings that I experience, these mental states? Are they just physical, chemical reactions and events? Or are they something we cannot explain physically? Leading on from that then, is if these thoughts and feelings are different to our bodies and separate from them, how can they communicate with our body? How can the thought of, I'm thirsty, make my body walk into the kitchen, fill the kettle and flick the switch? How can the feeling of tiredness make my body scoop 2 large spoonfuls of coffee instead of just one? So do minds and bodies have any connection at all? And if so, what is that connection? So all of these questions and many more are worked through in the philosophy of mind. But I suppose the main idea that we explore throughout is, what is the mind and all that goes on within it? And we answer this from a range of different theories. So let's have a look at the structure of the course. We've got a lot of theories of mind to get through. So firstly, we look at dualist theories of mind. And you might immediately twig that dual means there's two of something. Okay, so we're looking at the idea that there's two things involved in the mind-body issue. So what we do is explore substance dualism first, and the idea that humans do have two parts to them, a mind and a body. This mind is not just a part of the brain, it is very much independent of the brain. And then we move on to a whole series of physicalist theories. Now, physicalists believe that the mind is something physical, material, but they all believe this in a different way. We then look at a different theory, functionalism. And this claims that it doesn't really matter what the actual stuff of mind is. We should be looking instead at what the mind does. And lastly, the last thing we cover, we come back to property dualism. And this is a much more complex form of dualism. Property dualism claims that humans, at least some mental states, are non-physical, but they belong to a physical substance. So we have one physical substance, but some mental states cannot be reduced to the physical. Don't worry about understanding it yet. This is where we're going. A little bit that we need to start off with is the introductory part of the course. And this is over here on what do we mean by mind. So this is where we'll begin. Okay, perhaps more than any other area of this course, the A-level as a whole, the language for the metaphysics of mind is very technical. So I don't think the concepts are hard, but the language you use has to be very precise. So we're going to start off with looking at some of the main words and terms that we use so we can start to understand this key vocabulary and terminology. So we're almost going to make a glossary of terms. So what do we mean by mental states? Well, mental states refers to what goes on in our minds. our thoughts, feelings, desires, emotions, pains. But there's something else here too, and a lot of philosophers claim that we have a mental state that some mental states are known as qualia, and we'll deal with this next. Qualia is the plural and the singular is qual. Okay, qualia is one of the most important ideas that we're going to consider. A qual is a singular conscious experience. This is what it is like to feel, to smell, to hear, the feeling of snuggling up on the sofa with a hot chocolate. That feels a particular way. The experience of being in love, of biting into a warm buttered scone. Our consciousness feels like something. Now look very carefully at the language here. Qualia is defined as the intrinsic, or in itself, and non-intentional, we'll explain this a bit later, phenomenal properties that are introspectively or inwardly accessible or reached. Now, because they're private, I only know my qualia. I cannot know yours. It could be that you don't even experience qualia. This would make you a philosophical zombie. Imagine if other people move like us, say the same things as us, but we tend to assume it's because they have the same conscious experiences as us. But maybe not. Maybe you're watching this and there's nothing going on inside. Maybe my voice doesn't have any reaction in you other than your hand writing notes. Maybe you're a zombie. So qualia we'll talk a lot about, and even more a little bit later in this video, but it is the what it is like element of consciousness. Substance. Okay, we can define substance as a basic thing, and it doesn't rely on other things for its existence. So a body is a substance, and some people think that the mind is completely separate and is another substance. So some people believe that humans are made up of two different substances that don't rely on each other, and they're called substance dualists. Property. Okay, this term, property, is connected to substance. So properties are things that substances have. They can't exist on their own. So physical properties could be hairiness or spottiness, and mental properties can be thoughts, feelings, and so on. And they belong to a mental substance of some kind. So a property is something that belongs to a substance. Reduction. Okay, the idea of reduction is all over this topic, but there are different types of reduction that you need to be looking out for. But reduction means identifying one thing in terms of another. So if a higher level phenomenon can be explained in terms of a lower level phenomenon, we can say that it is reducible. So, for example, if consciousness can be explained by the operations of the brain, then consciousness can be reduced to brain activity. Now, one of the types of reduction that we look at is an ontological reduction. And this is when one thing is actually the same as another thing. They're ontologically actually the same. So in philosophy of mind, some people claim that the mind is the brain. The mind can be reduced to the brain. and we can say that something like a mental state actually is equal to a brain state. So identifying one thing as another thing under two different descriptions. Okay, so another type of reduction that we're going to be looking at is known as analytic reduction. And this just means when one thing means the same as another thing. So, for example, talking about mental events such as thirst can be summed up by talking about behaviour, by saying that you're thirsty, or pain, that's talk of a mental state. So we say the mental state of pain is equal to saying ouch, which is a behavioural state. Okay, so analytic reduction is when talk of one thing is the same as talking about another thing. Okay, they mean the same. Again, don't worry about this because we're going to be going through this theory by theory and going over it a lot. Monism is a term that we don't come across a lot because we don't really look at it under these terms. But it is the view that humans are composed of just one substance. So some people think that we are just bodily or we are just physical. And the people that think this are called physicalists. So one substance. Some say just body, they're physicalists. Now, you've already looked at people who think that everything is to do with the mind. Okay, and if you recall first year work, dredge it back up. I'm hoping that it will make sense to you when I put this down. Idealists believe that humans are composed of just one substance, and that is mind. Okay, mental states. That's the idealist. We don't really look at this for the philosophy of mind, but we very much physicalism. Okay, now we've already sort of covered this. Dualism. I've just put it in here because we've done monism. So let's look at dualism. Is the idea that the mind is not reducible to the physical. And there are at least some mental properties that are not reducible to physical properties. Now, we will look at that at length, but the key point is here that I'd like you to sort of be aware of are the idea of two things going on. Now, it depends what type of dualism that we're going to be looking at, what these two things are. But it is very much the idea that the mind is not reducible to something physical. At least not all the mind can be. And I think I'm going to start repeating myself here a little bit because we've already mentioned physicalism, otherwise known as materialism. Certainly in the past, that was the term that was used more often. And this is the idea from our physicalists or materialists that the mind is ultimately material in nature. It's not distinct from the body because it is in a way the body. Okay, so we will look at different physicalist theories. But if you see materialism, that's what it means. Neurology and neuroscience is just the science of the brain and the processes, its processes. And we will be looking into this a little bit to try and discover whether, the mind is simply brain activity. So let's have a little think then. I want you to pause this and have a go at trying to place the things over here, the terms, and matching them up with the terms over here. Okay, right, I'm hoping you've done it. You've had a go. So a basic thing which doesn't rely on anything else to exist, that is going to be a substance. This is when one thing is the same as another. For example, if the mind is the brain. Right, that is an ontological reduction. The science of the brain and its processes, neuroscience. Let's just do that. The intrinsic and non-intentional phenomenal properties that are introspectively accessible. That sounds really complicated. It's actually qualia. The idea that the mind is not reducible to the physical, well, that is dualism. The view that humans are composed of just one substance is monism. And the idea that the mind is ultimately material in nature and is not distinct from the body is physicalism. Okay. Now we're moving on slightly. That's just covering the language that we'll encounter when we're studying mind. We're actually moving on to the first bits of the topic that asks us to look at what we mean by mental states. And I think we can break down mental states into two main types. We've got the intentional mental states and non-intentional mental states, otherwise known as qualia. Let's have a little look at intentional. So some of our mental states, we say, have got intentional properties. Now, I've got this hand pointing for a reason, because they are about something. They are about something in the world. So when we introspect or think and look into our own minds, we recognise that our mental states, so our thoughts, our hopes, our desires, are about something. They are intentional. They're about something. They have a particular content that points to something. So in a proposition, this intentionality is reflected in the use of that. Okay, so I believe, that's my mental state, that it is raining outside. Okay, it is about outside, and in fact that you think it's raining. I wish, okay, another mental state. Now I'm wishing about philosophy. Okay, I wish that philosophy was an easier subject. What do you hope? I hope that I do well in this A-level. Okay, so can you see that hopes, thoughts, desires, these types of mental states are intentional. They have, we would say, we could call it an aboutness. Okay, they are about something. Right, so some of our mental states have intentional properties, but some don't, and we call these non-intentional mental states, otherwise known as qualia. This is just the phenomenal experience of consciousness. So I'm going to read this first. So some mental states have phenomenal properties. This is our subjective experience of our mental states. It's qualitative, and it's known as qualia. It is, and you can put this in your explanations, it is what it is like to experience something. But the tricky thing is, and we're saying it here, okay, it is ineffable. Now, ineffable means you can't put it into words. So this is why we might we might struggle with qualia because actually the experience can't be conveyed in language, but it is this feel, this qualitative experience of a conscious being. So if we just look at some of the elements of qualia here, then. So qualia is directly accessible. It's something we're very, very aware of because we reach it through introspection, and actually we can't sort of deny what we are experiencing. It's just the way it is. We just can't sort of argue with it. It's indubitable, okay, can't be doubted, because we are just experiencing certain things in a certain way. And qualia is said to be private, because, what I'm feeling and how I'm experiencing things, only I can know. And that leads to all kinds of problems in philosophy of mind. I can't know that you have qualia. And I've said here again that qualia is ineffable, ineffable, which just means it can't be put or conveyed in words. Okay, so that's it for our introduction to the philosophy of mind. Next time, we're going to delve into our first real theory, and that's substance dualism.